The number that sticks in my mind today, and has since I heard it, is 40%. 40%. While over 500,000 people in the U.S. have died during the year of the COVID pandemic, while millions of people have become sick, while millions of people have lost their jobs, their savings, their homes, and so many have been forced to wait in long food lines to get enough to feed their families, while all that was happening, the billionaires, the top 0.05% in the country, the Waltons, the Jeff Bezoses of the world, they saw their collective wealth go up 40%. And they revel in that obscene level of wealth. So since these folks are deeply amoral and will keep piling up their wealth and refuse to pay the workers who create their wealth a real wage, it's our job to take it away from them, which is what a wealth tax will start to do and which I talk about today. And speaking of using wealth to help people, how about getting a couple of $1 trillion at no cost to taxpayers to folks in poorer countries, which the U.S. could make happen in a snap? An idea I raised last year and revisit today. This is Jonathan Tassini, and it's great to have you with us for our show for March 3rd, 2021. The billionaires made crazy money during the pandemic by exploiting people and gaming the stock market. But this show, the show that exposes what the billionaires do, counts on our audience to keep us afloat. So go over to workinglife.org, become a sponsor today, look for the podcast tab, and click over there and you will see a link to Patreon, where you can sign up as a one-time sponsor or a monthly supporter at whatever level you can afford. Or you can do the same thing by using ActBlue. Go over to ActBlue and look for Working Life with Jonathan Tassini, and there you can also become a one-time sponsor or a monthly sponsor. Please do that today. Help this show just a little bit. A lot of you have probably watched the video Joe Biden made about the rights of workers to have a union. I want to run the video and the audio for my audience on the podcast audio side, and then make a couple of general points.
I've long said America wasn't built by Wall Street. It was built by the middle class, and unions built the middle class. Unions put power in the hands of workers. They level the playing field. They give you a stronger voice for your health, your safety, higher wages, protections from racial discrimination and sexual harassment. Unions lift up workers, both union and non-union, and especially black and brown workers. I've made it clear when I was running that my administration's policy would be to support unions organizing and the right to collectively bargain. I'm keeping that promise. You should all remember, the National Labor Relations Act didn't just say that unions are allowed to exist. It said that we should encourage unions. So let me be really clear. It's not up to me to decide whether anyone should join a union. But let me be even more clear. It's not up to an employer to decide that either. The choice to join a union is up to the workers, full stop. Full stop. Today and over the next few days and weeks, workers in Alabama and all across America are voting on whether to organize a union in their workplace. This is vitally important, a vitally important choice as America grapples with the deadly pandemic, the economic crisis, and the reckoning on race. What it reveals the deep disparities that still exist in our country. And there should be no intimidation, no coercion, no threats, no anti-union propaganda. No supervisor should confront employees about their union preferences. You know, every worker should have a free and fair choice to join a union. The law guarantees that choice. And it's your right, not that of an employer. It's your right. No employer can take that right away. So make your voice heard. God bless you all, and may God protect the workers and their families who are trying to figure out how to make it fairly. Thank you.
Okay, so first, that is probably the most explicit pro-union statement a president has made in my lifetime. Bill Clinton was horrible when it came to unions, mentioning them when he wanted to pick up a check from a union political action committee. Hell, in 1994, Clinton wouldn't even put pressure on the two senators from his own state of Arkansas to vote to break a filibuster that was blocking the passage of a bill to ban scabs, or in the policy lingo, striker replacements. A bill that would have made a big difference in union organizing and fighting for good wages because, let's face it, the biggest fear workers face is losing a job if they go on strike when companies can just replace them. And Obama, please, I remember the political rallies he had when he ran for president, promising to put on his sneakers and walk picket lines as just the most cynical ploy to buy votes I'd seen in a very long time because, of course, he did nothing of the sort. During his 2 terms, union organizing drives were broken all the time, and employers kept breaking the law with virtually no consequences. Which brings me to the second point. That Biden's video was something to behold shows how corrupt the system is. Biden simply stated facts of law. He didn't endorse the organizing drive at Amazon, which is going on right now and which I've covered multiple times. Check out our archives for the gripping segments on the Amazon organizing efforts. Biden did not call out Amazon or other corporations, meaning campaign and party donors by name. He did not call for massive penalties, including jail time, for CEOs who break labor laws or safety and health laws. The latter, when violated, kill workers or make them sick, which has actually happened plenty of times at Amazon. Penalties for union busting or even killing workers by violating health and safety laws are puny costs of doing business today and in no way deter illegal acts. There is a multi-billion-dollar massive anti-union industry which makes a mockery of the rights workers have in theory to join a union. So look, I am glad Biden made the video, and it will have a bit of a psychological boost for workers, but let's not be happy with these crumbs and realize that the system is still deeply corrupt and gives corporations a very free hand to destroy unions and target workers who are trying to exercise a theoretical right to join a union. Now, speaking of corrupt billionaires, how nice would it be to take a little more of their money, right? Now, we can do that with a wealth tax. And you might recall that both Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren proposed versions of a wealth tax during the 2020 campaign. We tax income in this country, but not wealth, which actually is how the truly rich pile up even more astounding riches. Their wealth grows and grows at our expense. Think of the Waltons of Walmart who pile up more wealth because their stock goes up by paying poverty wages. And now the idea of the wealth tax is back. The other day, Warren and Pramila Jayapal in the House rolled out an ultra-millionaires tax. It's co-sponsored by Congressman Brendan Boyle, he's from Pennsylvania, and in the Senate by Bernie Sanders, Sheldon Whitehouse, Jeff Merkley, Kirsten Gillibrand, Brian Schatz, Ed Markey, and Mazie Hirono. I wanted to name check all those folks to give them a little bit of credit. The tax would only be on the wealthiest 100,000 households in America, or the top 0.05%, who have a net worth of $50 million. And I'm just spitballing here, but a wild guess that doesn't include anyone in my audience. Though who knows, maybe we have a spy or two. I don't know why the tax shouldn't apply to those poor people with $25 million in wealth, but it's a start, I reckon. Now, the ultra-millionaire tax would bring in at least, listen to this, $3 trillion in revenue over 10 years. So that's not chump change. So the wealth tax rollout is a good excuse to bring back on the show one of my favorite smart people, Amy Hanauer, the executive director of the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. So there is no such thing necessarily in the world as a complete no-brainer. But if there is such a thing as a no-brainer, this certainly qualifies to me as a no-brainer. And I'll use this one statistic that will blow everybody away that I now fall back on, which I'll let you then take off on, is during this pandemic, and you've heard this, in the past year, while 500,000 people have tragically died, while millions of people have gotten sick, while millions of people have lost their jobs, where you've got lines of people in cars trying to get food so they can feed their families, not to mention people depleting all their savings, the billionaires saw their wealth go up 40%. Yeah. So this would be, you would think, a perfect time to talk about a wealth tax.
A perfect time. You're absolutely right. I mean, look, this is like one lesson that I am learning is like capitalism marches on, right? And it does its thing in good times and bad. And that's the reason why we've got to set up systems that actually like account for that and figure out how do we have a share of our economy that goes to all of our well-being, that helps all of us do well in good times and bad. And I agree with you completely. So Senator Warren has introduced her wealth tax. You know, it's something she talked about on the campaign trail over and over again. And I think it would be a great addition to the United States tax code.
Now, to the point I just made before, when she talked about this on the campaign trail, the estimate of what a wealth tax would bring in, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the specifics about it. At that time, it was around $2.3 trillion over a decade. Because of what I just mentioned, the calculation now is $3 trillion. So if we're thinking all about this notion of how we're going to fund education, of course, we could cut the Pentagon, which is a conversation for another segment sometime. But that's a huge amount of money that the country could use, not to mention what I'm working on and interested in, the whole question of how we deal with climate change and the transition of workers from industries that are going to get shut down, like coal, into industries where they can make a decent living. But again, for another segment. But the point is, it's a huge amount of money, right?
Absolutely. So, I mean, there's two big reasons in my mind that we should have a wealth tax. One is that we've got incredible inequality. We've got incredible income inequality, but we've got even more unbelievable wealth inequality. And a wealth tax is really the only way that we can address that wealth inequality. But the second reason, and for me, in a lot of ways, the more important reason, is that we got things that we have to pay for in this country, right? Like, we haven't invested in a green economy. We haven't transitioned our economy to deal with the climate crisis. We still need to get vaccines out this time, but I mean, it's a different crisis in a different time. We are not investing the way we need to in the next generation, as you say, in terms of education and childcare and pre-K. So, and college. So there are just a whole bunch of things that this country needs to invest in because our people need them and our communities need these things. And a wealth tax is a way to raise the revenue to do that and to raise it from the people that benefit the most from the society we've set up. So what did you say at the opening? It's a no-brainer. It really is.
It should be a no-brainer. And actually, one of the things I read was it has overwhelming support. This wouldn't shock people from people who consider themselves Democrats, but it also has, according to one poll that was done, majority support from Republicans. Now, we know from the recent debate that's been going on about the $15 minimum wage, the federal minimum wage, to raise it to $15. It really is irrelevant what Republican voters think because of what the actual politicians and the Trump people do in actual reality. But again, leave that for another time. I want to make mention, in fairness, to the other people who are co-sponsoring the bill. In the House, there's Pramila Jayapal, who's a member of the House Budget Committee, who, as you know, is a terrific progressive advocate. And there are a number of people in the Senate who are co-sponsoring it: Jeff Merkley, Bernie Sanders, of course, and several others. So Brian Schatz, Mazie Hirono, Ed Markey, Kirsten Gillibrand, and Sheldon Whitehouse in the Senate. So to give them credit as well, although certainly Elizabeth Warren has been at the forefront on this question. So let's talk specifically about how this would work. The bill would create, and now I'm now reading from a summary, and then I'm going to let you talk about this, a fairer economy through a 2% annual tax on net worth of households and trusts between $50 million and $1 billion. So I think that excludes you and me. And then a 1% annual surtax, and we 3% overall, on net worth of households and trusts above $1 billion. That certainly excludes you and me. So do those categories make sense to you in terms of where she drew the line?
Yeah, I think those make a lot of sense. It's like the top 1/10 of 1%, I think is what yeah, this wouldn't hit anyone who was less than 1/10 of the top 1%. So it's really, it's really well targeted toward the people who have just walked away with just an enormous share of this economy. And the last I looked, I think the top, I mean, sometimes these numbers get ridiculous to sort of try to even say, but the wealthiest one out of every 1,000 people, in many years, they have 1 out of 5 of the dollars in our economy. So it's just like, it's a preposterous system that this bill, I think, is really well targeted to take it on. Nobody's going to be poor after this. Nobody who's listening to your show has to worry about it hitting them. And, certainly you and I don't need to worry about it hitting us.
Yes, and as Elizabeth Warren pointed out, it only affects, to your point, 0.05%. So that would leave 99.95% of American households, because those folks have a net worth below $50 million. It wouldn't touch them.
And it wouldn't touch your first 50 million, right? So
I know, goodness, because 20 million isn't what it used to be, right? And so we don't want to hurt those people who have 20 or 25 million. Good God forbid they might have to maybe not buy a third house or go without 2 yachts. I mean, it would be a real crisis for those really rich people.
exactly.
So I have a couple of questions in some of the specifics beyond the tax itself. One of the things that Warren is suggesting is a $100 billion investment to rebuild and strengthen the IRS. Now, most people would say, my God, does the IRS need $100 billion to modernize? And why would we put that money into the IRS?
Yeah, I think you and I might have talked about this once before, right? One of the problems right now is that the IRS actually isn't able to audit all of the really wealthy people. And so in fact, they've turned some of their attention to much less wealthy people because those are easier audits, but it makes no sense. And so, one of the things that my federal policy director, Steve Wamhoff, here at the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, where I work, one of the things that Steve is often saying is like, it doesn't matter what the rates are. If we don't enforce the law, it's not going to matter. And so we really do need the IRS to be well funded and to target its resources toward those who have walked away with so much in our society. And right now, that's why Donald Trump, right, where we were able to see that whatever it was, that he paid $750 in 2 years and he paid nothing in a whole bunch of years prior to that, even though he's running around acting like a multimillionaire billionaire. So it really is important that the IRS have the resources to do its job. And I guess I'll say one more thing, which is like, we often think, things ought to be easy. This stuff is hard, right? It takes resources. I lived in Cleveland for many years. I now live in Washington, D.C. People are often joking like, oh, Clevelanders are better drivers. And you'll hear that a lot from people in Cleveland. And, I think they are probably a little better at driving in the snow. But the fact is that a city like Cleveland puts a huge amount of resources into getting the snow off the ground. And so if you go to a southern city that doesn't put those resources into that service, you don't have that service. And so there's more accidents when it snows. It's the same thing with the IRS. Unless you have the resources and you devote them to something, government can't do its job.
You were telepathic, because the second thing I was going to raise was, in fact,
Snowplows?
Huh?
Snowplows?
Warren wants to actually have a 30% minimum audit rate for taxpayers subject to this new ultra millionaire tax. And you could only do that if you actually had lots more resources.
That's right. And the other thing is it more than pays for itself. I actually always want to get this number into things I'm writing, and the number varies widely, but the very lowest number I've ever seen is that it pays for itself 8 times over if you have this enforcement.
Yes, and so enforcement is really important. And one of the things that we have to make clear to the average taxpayer, because the relentless attacks against the IRS over many years by Republicans, but also Democrats really, I don't think, defend enough the role of the IRS is the IRS is seen as the enemy. And in this case, if you could show the people that the money being invested actually went to go after those big, rich people, that would make a difference, I think, in people's support for what the IRS does.
Right. And look, it's just, this is how we get the resources to do the things we need, right? Like, you like being able to pay for college. You like the idea that a working class kid could go to college. You like the idea that a low income mom could get childcare for her kid. You like the idea that we're going to, actually put up some wind turbines or some solar panels. We got to pay for it. And so that means that we have to have taxes.
Another aspect of what Warren is proposing is a 40% exit tax on the net worth above $50 million of any U.S. citizen who renounces their citizenship. Now, from my point of view, if you want to renounce your citizenship because we're asking you to pay your fair share in taxes, don't let the door hit you on the way out, is what I would say. But I wonder, and this is my question to you, I've often heard a parallel argument, you've heard this too as a tax expert, that we can't raise taxes on wealthy people, say in the state of New York, because they'll pick up stakes and run for another state, which is a lower tax state. And in fact, the evidence shows that that just doesn't happen. So my question is about this. Do you actually think that someone who has a net worth of $100 million, $200 million, when it actually comes down to it, are they going to run and try to renounce their citizenship and head to some other country?
Look, they're earning their money here. I mean, they're earning their money because of things that they've gotten through our system. And so I think it's going to be highly unlikely. It certainly doesn't happen nearly as much as it's talked about in between states. Carl Davis on our staff writes a lot about the millionaire migration myth, right? It's just a myth, that people don't leave the place where they've built up a business to go somewhere else where there aren't resources to build up that business. And the reason that people build up businesses often in the higher tax states here, and certainly in higher tax places, is that you need well-educated employees that you're going to be able to hire. You need infrastructure that you're going to get your products out to market on. There are things that you need that you get from a well-oiled system like ours and a well-funded system like ours. And it hasn't been as well-funded as it needs to be. But from a wealthy country, there are things that you get that you're just not going to be able to get by leaving.
I feel like this is always that ideological argument that's done in a knee-jerk way by conservatives and people who just hate taxes. They just throw these things out to scare politicos and politicians, frankly, partly because those politicians get their money through campaign donations from some of these wealthy people. But they throw those out to scare people from taking action when the reality is it doesn't happen. I remember, it's a rough anecdote. Someone asked, I think Bill Gates, or maybe it was even Zuckerberg or one of those folks, they were asked, hey, if you had to pay a higher capital gains tax, would that have prevented you from investing from the outset in Microsoft and becoming a multi-billionaire or some other big company if you knew you had to pay a little more, but you were going to make scads of money? And the answer, of course, is no. It doesn't stop people from actually doing that when they know they're going to be wealthier than they could ever imagine.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. It's not really the way the tax system works. People, but it's a nice myth. But the fact is that we need these things to be well funded so that these people can make their money. And like research, the R&D that people rely on that is funded by the public sector for almost every business, it just it really points to the need for a well-funded society.
So last question I'm going to ask you is to look into your crystal ball and think now as a policy political person. I mean, look, we just went through the crucible here of debating whether to raise the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour, which I want to reemphasize. I always say this to my audience, is still not enough. It really has to be way above $20 an hour to take into account productivity. But $15 an hour would be a whole lot better than what it is now, raising it from a real poverty wage to a slightly above poverty wage. But my point is that a lot of that was blocked, and the reason it's not going to potentially be passed, we'll still see if there's a fight to be had, is from people like Joe Manchin and some of these so-called moderates, so-called conservatives. I'm putting aside the Republican Party because I assume every single one of them would be against a wealth tax. So my question is, politically speaking, is this going to pass? Does it have a chance of getting through and being signed into law? And it's not even clear, by the way, that Joe Biden supports this.
Yeah, I mean, I am not a great political prognosticator. I don't think we can always anticipate what there's going to be a policy window for. But what I would say about the wealth tax is it's a good idea. It's popular. It would solve some of our enormous problems. It would make America a better place. So, let's hope that that's maybe something that elected officials can respond to.
Yes, it's a minimal step. I mean, I believe that having billionaires in general is a policy failure from the get-go. We should not have people like this making this amount of money, especially when you don't have unionized workplaces where people can't make a decent wage. And those are the people who actually create the wealth, not these billionaires. But that's maybe a topic for another time. As usual, Amy, thank you for your expertise and your genius on these issues. And we're going to follow this and have you back, not just on this topic, but other topics. Thanks for being with us.
Always so much fun to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Through the pandemic, I've made a point of raising the crisis facing millions of workers in poorer and developing countries. It's been even more devastating in poorer countries because economies shut down in places where people barely survived on a good day on slave wages. And to compound the economic crisis, millions of people were getting sick and dying from COVID-19 because work conditions in crowded factories and basic housing and transportation in so many countries simply do not allow for social distancing. Hunger was skyrocketing, with the number of people facing starvation likely doubling from 135 million pre-pandemic, which is a stark figure on its own, to 260 million people. As many as 1 million people in the world are currently projected to die from COVID in just the next 3 months. But millions more could die in the coming year from hunger and disease because of this worldwide economic collapse. Many of these countries were already staggering around huge debt burdens. Low and middle income countries are on the hook just in 2020 and 2021 for somewhere between $2.7 to $3.4 trillion in debt service payments alone, which is just crazy. So as I mentioned last year, there was some chance a big wad of money could be unleashed for poorer countries to tap into to confront the pandemic. After World War II, and here's a little policy history lesson, the key world economic powers created two institutions, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Now, I'm no fan of the IMF, which is dominated by the U.S. and mostly has forced countries to do painful economic restructuring over a number of decades, which actually meant getting rid of social services, removing regulation, rolling out the welcome mat for global corporations to troll for big profits in exchange for getting badly needed loans. Those loans were so onerous to these countries that lots of them could not hope to pay them back, and the debt just grew, which then brought more painful austerity measures that hurt, surprise, workers and poor people. With that background, let's then go to 2009, when the Great Recession rippled through the world. The International Monetary Fund created a big pool of money using a special tool called Special Drawing Rights, or SDRs. I hate acronyms. Essentially, this is money in the form of a credit that countries can tap into and then essentially convert them into dollars. In 2009, hundreds of billions of dollars in SDRs helped many countries get through the crisis with less unemployment and less overall suffering. The same can be done today. Since last year, hundreds of leaders around the globe have been pushing the IMF to create $2 to $3 trillion in COVID-19 related special drawing rights, which could be used to lower the global death toll by building up healthcare systems or just providing food and economic relief. Now, here's an important point. These special drawing rights are outright grants, not loans. So countries would not be adding to their already big debt burdens, which is really important. It's just a no-brainer. If you don't care about people's lives, look at it from a capitalist standpoint, which is the reason Goldman Sachs and other business leaders have been among those quietly or more publicly pushing for the SDRs. They want to stop the global economy from imploding, and they need the recovery to make money. And the only way to do that is to provide a big flood of support to countries so people stay healthy and economic activity perks up. Now, during the Trump regime monstrosity, the U.S., which has the biggest voice at the IMF, was blocking the creation of these SDRs for reasons that are frankly mostly ideological, piggishly so. Even the head of the IMF, who normally wouldn't cross the U.S., has publicly been on board for many, many months. And a big chunk, about $475 billion worth, could have been created by the IMF just with the U.S. president saying, sure, go ahead. You wouldn't even need congressional action. Okay, so here's some good news. There's movement on this. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen appears to be in favor of some level of the special drawing rights, if not the full $2 trillion that's now in the newly resurrected bills in the Senate and House. Now, here to give us the new update on this complicated story is Mark Weisbrot. Mark is co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research and expert in international affairs, and he has been a leading activist organizing this campaign for over a year. So it's funny, Mark, we addressed this whole issue almost a year ago. Last May, I checked back on our audio show. Now we have this fancy video show as well on our YouTube channel, so we get to see your handsome self as well. And all my audio listeners, all our audience really should be subscribing to our TV show as well. And back in May, it was really interesting. In some way, things have flipped a little bit, and we're going to get into it, sort of the different dynamics from a year ago and now. But let's start with the simple explanation of what a special drawing right is.
Well, thanks for doing this first, and thanks for having me here. I think that the easiest way to explain it is it's a reserve asset that's created by the International Monetary Fund. So there's 189 member countries in the IMF, and they all have an account there. And the IMF has an asset that it creates. So, sometimes the media calls it a virtual currency or something, but it's kind of like that, but it's a little different in the sense that you can't spend it. But the main thing is, you can, in fact, a country, if it can show need at the IMF, can convert the special drawing rights into dollars or four other currencies, hard currencies, and use them. And so that makes it really important because every country in the world has to have reserves and has to have hard currency, except the US, we can create the dollar that everyone else uses. But most of the other countries, almost every other country in the world, has to have dollars, or sometimes they can use euros, but they have to have over 60% of the world's central bank current central bank assets are in dollars. So they need that. If you run into if you don't have enough of these reserves, these what they're called international reserves, you can run into horrible problems. You can not be able to import food and medicine, and you can have balance of payments crises that lead to terrible things. So that's what the IMF can do with this. The IMF can create them and distribute them to its member countries. It did that in 2009, hundreds of billions of dollars worth, and it wants to do that now.
So maybe the way of explaining it to the layperson is the way I thought of it back when we first talked about it. It's like an accounting line. So at the IMF, if these special drawing rights were created, I'm going to simplify it a little bit, there'd be a line item there, say for South Africa or Brazil or another country that really needs it, and says you have this amount of hard dollars or special drawing rights, which you can then say to a multinational corporation, to your point about food, medicines, we have this currency essentially, and it's banked at the IMF. And I'm simplifying and probably getting the actual financial part wrong. But generally speaking, is that a good way of thinking about it? That's like an entry, a line item?
That's right. It's an accounting entry at the IMF, but it's a reserve asset, just like central banks all over the world hold US Treasury securities. And those aren't money, but they can be converted very easily. They're liquid. They can be converted very easily into money. So this is really important because, first of all, some of the countries are going to need the money just to get, uh, protective equipment and medicine and even food in this crisis. This is in the worst world recession since 1870 over the last year. So they need this money. They need the assets. And the interesting thing, this is important too, because the question is, well, how much should they create? Well, even though only a small proportion of these are actually going to be converted to hard currency, the stuff that just sits there as the line item that you're describing plays a big role because it means that the countries have assets so they can borrow at lower cost. They're not as likely to have capital fleeing the country. They're not as likely to run into debt crises and financial budget crises. So this is something that was really needed. And as you said, it started a year ago when the managing director of the IMF in March of last year said, "Look, we really need this, and we have to create this."
Now, let's take a couple of points there about the financial aspect, and then I want to get to the politics of this. Many of the countries that we're talking about that desperately need this already were shouldering huge debt from the past. What's important about this is, number one, these special drawing rights don't add to debt that many of these third world countries have, the poorer countries have. And then to build on your point, it actually gives them additional assets so they can go out into the world and bring in food and bring in other really important items that they've now been suffering, especially in the last year, because of the global collapse, because of the global depression. It's not just a recession, it's depression in many countries. And so this is really a matter of life and death for many countries.
Very much so. In fact, the University of Washington is projecting up to a million people dying in the next 3.5 months, and that's from the COVID. And in fact, many more people die and have died over the last year from the economic effects of the COVID recession. It's much more deadly than the COVID itself. So this is really needed very badly.
And especially as we look at these variants that are starting to spread, it's hitting countries, South Africa and Brazil, I mentioned, and other countries that would especially benefit from these special drawing rights.
That's right. And, the other thing that we haven't mentioned yet is what happened in March. As soon as the IMF managing director announced this, the US Treasury Secretary, which was Mnuchin, blocked it at the IMF. And this is another terrible thing about the international economic structure, the so-called governance, is that the United States has this veto, and together with the other rich countries, although they didn't even need them to block this, they get to decide, even though 188 countries in the IMF probably are well over 180, let's say, of the 189 countries want this. The US Treasury has blocked it.
So let's walk through now. That was a great transition that you helped me with on trying to talk about the politics. So let's build this a little bit going back to where you started last year. First of all, explain to people, again, very briefly, why is it that the United States has a veto over this issue or any issue in front of the IMF? That, I think, is a result of the way it was set up in the post-World War II era, right?
Yes, that goes back to 1946 and when these institutions were created. And so, yeah, it's a colonial system still in many ways. You have the IMF and the World Bank, and they're controlled almost completely by the rich countries, but most of the United States. But because Europe will go along with the United States on almost everything. Like right now, for example, they really want this too, but are they making noise about it? Are they fighting with them? Not really, because they have a kind of a rich country alliance against the rest of the world. and they pretty much stick to it. And you know the story of the World Trade Organization and the other multilateral organizations. These are run by the rich countries.
So the Trump folks blocked it, and essentially they were the only ones in the world that were blocking it because, as you point out, countries everywhere, and I think right now you have 180 countries, 189 countries who are members of the IMF, but basically almost everybody wants it. And mostly it's not necessarily because of some great morality play. This is a reality of economics, that if these countries suffer and continue to be closed down because of the virus and can't get enough money for food, then essentially the global economy stays shut down, or at least is basically frozen in many ways. So the Trumpsters basically were blocking it, mainly for ideological reasons, I think. And then you've got a switch in the administrations. And as I looked at this information preparing for a conversation, it looked like there's been somewhat of a change, especially on the part of Janet Yellen, who's now the Treasury Secretary, and actually was, as you know, the former chair of the Federal Reserve Board. She actually supports this idea. So, number one, it seems somewhat more optimistic that at least a portion of this will move forward, right?
Yes, well, let's go back just to the last year for a minute, because, when I started on this in March of last year, I thought it was going to be low-hanging fruit. Everybody wanted it. And it's good for the United States too. We lost 2 million jobs here in the US last year, about 2 million, due to not anything that was happening here, but to the recession in the world economy, that is export-related jobs. And most of those will come back as the rest of the world recovers. And so we have an interest in it here as well. You didn't have any opposition from Wall Street or the big financial corporations, because they own debt all over the world. They don't want more countries going into default. It's not good for them. So it should have been easy. But the Trump administration, for whatever reasons, blocked it. So we got a coalition together of over 100 organizations, big religious denominations, Oxfam, AFL-CIO, everybody who has any progressive lobby in Congress joined this. And we got 2 bills passed in the House of Representatives that said, that instructed, Congress actually instructed Treasury, which it has the right to do, to go to the IMF and advocate for a 2 trillion SDR issuance. And so that passed twice in the House, but the Senate is controlled by the Republicans, and they blocked it there.
And let's underscore an important point here. You mentioned this whole coalition of progressive folks, the AFL-CIO, et cetera, but also Goldman Sachs was supporting it as well, to your point that many of these capitalists, these big financial institutions, they want the global economy to recover. They're very practical because they have all sorts of businesses, debt, companies that are basically struggling to create revenue because the global economy is shut down, especially because these poorer countries can't function.
That's right. Although they didn't ever say anything. I mean, there were like Jim O'Neill, former head of Goldman Sachs. He wrote about it and others, but they didn't push because they didn't want to mess with Trump and the Republicans in the Senate. So you didn't see them, but behind the scenes, they were for it. They just weren't going to do anything because, they took their first priorities first, big tax cuts, things that go right to them. They didn't want to put any of that at risk by confronting the Republicans. So you haven't seen, I shouldn't say all of them. The International Chamber of Commerce signed on with all the progressive organizations and supports legislation.
And to make it this clear, so that folks who are listening want to talk about this doesn't cost the U.S. taxpayer a dime, and it doesn't create new debt for the other countries. So it's a no-brainer to create these SDRs and basically allow all these poorer countries to recover from the pandemic and from the economic collapse. So it was just ideology, stupid ideology, it seems, I'm shocked, right? Ideology driving economics. It seems like stupid ideology on the part of the Trump administration, Mnuchin in particular. And then you've got Janet Yellen as the new Treasury Secretary, who seems somewhat warmer, although, and you'll explain this, she doesn't seem to want to go as far as we need to go in terms of the scope of the SDR. So explain that.
Well, first of all, we don't really know completely, but I think that's a good enough explanation. You know, it's a good enough guess. It's my guess too. I mean, they have political reasons they didn't want it. Now, here's how it works in terms of the actual getting the SDRs. The U.S. under U.S. law, the U.S. Treasury Department can, at the IMF, vote to approve up to about 475 billion SDRs, which is $685 billion worth. So they can do that without consent, without Congress voting on it. If they want to do more, the 2 trillion that the U.S., most of the U.S. Congress wants, they have to get the vote in Congress, which the Republicans are blocking. So we thought at least the Treasury Department would go for what they can do by themselves. And but they're dragging their feet a little. And so that's a problem. And I think it's still a lot of the same influences, the Republican influence. That is, not that Yellen has to listen to them, but there's an attempt to try and, I don't know, they're not going to reach a bipartisan agreement in the Senate on this, and they don't have to. So it's just the influence of whoever the people are who don't want this is still there. And Yellen hasn't decided exactly what she's going to do. And so it's hard to say exactly who's holding it up now, but it's not moving as fast as it can move. And this is a life or death matter. I mean, Treasury should just approve it like they did in 2009. You know, once Geithner decided to do this, it was all over. It didn't matter if any other governments understood it or wanted it. He just did it. And Yellen can do it too.
So let's clarify a few things that you brought up. Each SDR is actually worth more than just $1. Your point is you can allocate X amount and it actually ends up being far more money, currency, and dollars in real terms. And the second point, I just want to emphasize again, it has to be about some foolish ideology or some opposition to a particular country getting money, because it's a no-brainer, as we've already discussed. You should be in favor of this, even if it's not on the moral level that you actually care about people dying and people suffering. From simply a capitalist standpoint, these SDRs would help the global economy recover, which means companies would have more business, especially in the export industries.
Yes, it really should be a no-brainer. Well, you have different sources of opposition. I can't really say, again, what's holding it up at any particular moment. But you have people who, first of all, the way this works, and this is the reason why we did this, you know, why we've spent so much time and resources on it. And I say we, I mean all the groups that are working on this, is because it's the simplest way to provide aid to all these countries. As you mentioned, and you've been making the most important points here. And thank you for doing that. I mean, one, that it's not debt. It doesn't add to any country's debt. And two, that it has zero cost to the US government. And so we thought it was going to be a very easy lift. And so what are the problems of these people who are opposing it and blocking it at various levels? I think one is, it's very simple. When under IMF rules, the money goes to all countries. The US gets the biggest chunk of it because it's proportional. Well, it's not money. The SDRs go to all countries. And the US gets the biggest chunk of it because we have the biggest quota at the IMF. It's proportional to your quota at the IMF. Well, it doesn't matter that that most of it goes to the high income countries because they don't use it. You know, they wouldn't even be allowed to use it. So it really is going to the low and middle income countries who need it. But you have people in the US foreign policy establishment, including the Republicans who blocked it, who don't want it to go to their enemy states, whether it's China, Iran, Venezuela, North Korea. Well, no, North Korea is not a member of the IMF, so they don't have to worry about that. But they all have countries they hate, and they don't want it to go to them. Even though China can't even use it. They got 3 trillion in reserves, they're dollars, most of them dollars. They couldn't use it. So it's that kind of they would rather see all these people in the world, millions actually, die than have anything go to a country they don't like, even if that country can't use it. And that's I think part of it for some of these senators. And then you have power. This is an awesome power that the United States has in the world, because this. When the world runs into trouble, the world economy, and everybody needs dollars, there's only one source. It's the Federal Reserve, and they create these swap lines for the countries that they want to help, which is only countries that do exactly what the U.S. wants them to do in all spheres of political activity and foreign policy. And so that's a power that they don't want to undermine with this multilateral institution being something like what Keynes and a lot of people wanted it to be in 1946, which was a central bank. It doesn't convert it into a central bank, but it allows it to play a function that's similar to what our central bank does in the United States, okay? And that is something that a lot of people don't want, because it undermines their enormous monopoly power to decide who lives and who dies. They have the power of God, and they want to keep it that way. And there's a lot of people in government who are like that.
And it's funny that we're talking this way as if the IMF is the good guy here, or at least the creation of these SDRs is a good thing, because I remember, and I know you've been in these fights too, the IMF and the World Bank, mainly the IMF, they're the ones that did so many what I consider to be bad things in countries around the world, forcing austerity on various countries in return for all sorts of loans. So all of a sudden, it's hard to kind of wrap my brain around the idea that the IMF is trying to do a good thing here.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, I've been researching and writing about the IMF for over 20 years, and generally I've been fighting with them and criticizing their loans and the conditions they put on them. But this is actually something that they almost never do, and it's positive, because the IMF rules are just set up like this. They can't really do anything. They can't attach conditions to this issuance, and it goes to everyone. And it's very simple. It'll happen immediately as soon as it's approved, and that's what it did in 2009, and it helped a lot of countries. And so it is something really good that they can do. And to tell you the truth, it is in some ways the battle that was fought and lost in 1946. When Keynes and other economists wanted the IMF to be able to play this role, because, look at our central bank. They created over $6 trillion in the Great Recession, and over 3 trillion since the pandemic. And that has helped us here.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mark, thanks again for bringing this issue back to my audience, and we're going to keep track of this and have you back on as this fight continues. The last question I'm going to ask is, what can our audience do? Is there things that you want folks to do? Pick up the phone, call your members of Congress, or is this really an internal fight where we have to pressure people like Janet Yellen to do the right thing?
Well, the good way to pressure Janet Yellen for people around the country is to just go to their members of Congress and say, and ask them to do it. Ask them to lobby Treasury to get this done. And also, it's not over in the Congress yet either. Those bills are both introduced in the House and the Senate. They were reintroduced this year for the 2 trillion, and that's going to be something that'll be fought out over the year. So right now, the most urgent thing is to get the 500 billion SDRs that the Treasury can do without Congress, or 475 billion. And then over the year, the members of Congress, the leadership of Congress, really, because they passed it in the House already, and the leadership of the Senate supports it, there's going to be a struggle to get more. So it's best to go to their members of Congress because they can do it by themselves in Congress, and they can also influence Treasury to get it done in a hurry.
All right, folks, you have your marching orders. Get out there and fight for this. Again, Mark, thanks for being on the show, and we'll have you back to update us.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan.
That'll do it for this week's broadcast. Thanks to my guests, Amy Hanauer and Mark Weisbrot. Our editor, as usual, is David Hebden. Help us keep after those billionaires every week by becoming a sponsor. Go over to workinglife.org, look for the podcast tab, and click over there, and you will see a link to Patreon where you can sign up as a one-time sponsor or a monthly supporter. Or go over to ActBlue and look for Working Life with Jonathan Tassini, and there you can also become a one-time sponsor or a monthly sponsor. Hey, stay safe out there. Thanks for being with us. Look forward to having you back next week.